Well, it's getting late in the day, but we've got to read one chapter before I get out of here. I know there's some afternoon chores to do down at the house, and as I'm recording this, it's 4:22. So, but maybe it won't take us too long to read chapter 9. And I think it's only got 12 chapters, so there won't be very many more days left. Okay, chapter 9. I wasn't like Rita. I couldn't go running all over the country talking to people the way she did. Not after what happened to us. I was ashamed to show my face. So Tom borrowed the Ritter's car and he drove her instead. I know she was disappointed in me, but the farm was the only place I felt safe, and I refused to leave it, even to be with my best friends. I called Forrest Ann to say I wouldn't attend the Persian Pickle Club, which was at her house that day. Mrs. Judd stopped by for me anyway. I heard her turn off the motor of the Packard and coast to a stop by my back steps. And I went to the kitchen door to see who it was. Ella peered over the big dashboard and fluttered her hand at me. Mrs. Judd was already halfway up the stairs when I reached the door. Each step creaked and turned as she put her weight on it. She stopped at the door, breathing hard, the sweat on her face making her warts shine like little steel tacks. I didn't know you were feeling up to driving. I didn't know if you were feeling up to driving to Pickle this afternoon. Ella and I came to fetch you, she said to me through the screen. Old Bob got up off the floor and peered out at her, then wagged his tail. He was good company, but he wasn't much of a watchdog. I'm not going today, I told her. Thank you just the same. Yes, you are, Mrs. Judd said as she yanked at the screen door. It didn't open because I began putting the hook. Let me get adjusted. It didn't open because I began putting the hook on when Grover wasn't in the house. Thunderation, you're living like a crow in a cage. Open this door. I wanted to tell her it was none of her business if I locked up my house. Instead, I said, I have a headache. I'm not going. You've never had a headache in your life, Queenie Bean. Now unlatch this screen. Mrs. Judd folded back the veil on her hat and pushed up her sleeves, ready to yank the door off the hinges if I didn't mind her. So I reached up and lifted the hook, and Mrs. Judd stepped inside. She was still puffy, not just from the exertion of climbing the stairs, but from the strain of looking after Ella the past weeks. Ella had gotten even more childlike, and I wondered if she might live with the Judds forever. Mrs. Judd settled herself on a kitchen chair, intending to stay there until she'd spoken her mind. Now, Queenie, I know you've had a hard time of it. I'm not saying you haven't, but there's others less fortunate than you. You don't know the half of it. She stopped a minute and frowned, as if she had said too much. You can't stay locked up in here feeling sorry for yourself like Lizzie Olive would have done, or you can't put the bad time behind you like Ella did, or think about all the good things the Lord gave you. And he'll keep on giving them to you if you'll let him. But how can you take advantage of his opportunities if you're sitting behind the kitchen door with the hook on? Mrs. Judd took a breath and leaned forward, resting her forearms on her thighs. Here's another thing. Forrest Ann's already setting the celebrity quilt, and we're going to start stitching on it this afternoon. You ought to be there because we're all excited about it, that we might stay and finish it up by evening. And wouldn't that be a shame if you didn't get one stitch on it? So you go put on that orchid dress with the yellow rickrack that makes you look so sweet, and then we'll be on our way. Mrs. Judd shifted her weight, putting a strain on the chair, whose joints squeaked in protest. You got any of Sarah's burnt sugar cake left for us to sample? I'll get it out of the fridge myself. Ella needs something that'll stick to her bones. As she got up to rummage through my refrigerator, she called through the door, Ella, sugar pie? Queenie wants you to come on in here for refreshments while we wait. The celebrity quilt changed my mind about attending Persian Pickle. I felt more comfortable going now that someone else would take me because I was afraid that if I got behind the wheel of the Studebaker, I'd shake too much to drive. So I changed my dress and brushed my hair, and by the time I was ready, Ella and Mrs. Judd were rinsing off their plates in the sink. Grover came out of the barn as I got into the Packard. When I told him I was going to club after all, he just nodded as if he'd expected me to. He and Mrs. Judd might have cooked this up between them. If they had, I was especially glad since Rita was there ahead of me. I was surprised because Rita didn't like Persian pickle the way I did, and I'd already told her I wasn't going, so I thought she'd stay home too. She came skipping out of Forrest Ann's house when she saw me and whispered, "I think driving with Mrs. Judd would be as scary as, you know," she laughed. Nettie overheard and was shocked, not because we'd said something against Mrs. Judd's driving. We all made remarks about that. Nettie acted as if it was blasphemous for us to joke about what had happened to us. Of course, it would have been if our husbands had, or even the other Pickles, but the jokes were a bond between Rita and me, and making fun of that night helped us. Rita drew me off to one side. "I had a look at the coroner's report," she whispered. "Doc Sipes wrote there wasn't a thing about Ben's body that proved he'd been murdered. For all he knew, Ben had fallen out of a tree and somebody put him in the ground to save the cost of a funeral. Now, why would he say a thing like that?" I shook my head. "Why would he unless somebody paid him to?" she asked. "And who's the only one in Harveyville who has enough money to spend bribing a coroner?" Rita glanced in Mrs. Judd's direction. Mrs. Judd saw us looking at her and called me to come inside to see the celebrity quilt. And in my excitement, I forgot about Doc Sipes and who might want to pay him to put lies on his report. The celebrity quilt was beautiful. Over the summer, as the autographs had come in, we'd embroidered them in red, but we'd waited until fall to put the quilt together, just in case some of the famous people we'd written to had been on vacation and hadn't gotten their mail. Forrest Ann and Mrs. Ritter assembled the embroidered squares into rows, setting off each one with borders of red cotton. Then they stitched the strips together into a quilt. Where the corners met, they added tiny red and white 9-patch squares. It was as fresh and as pretty a quilt as I'd ever seen. Forrest Ann had set it into the wooden quilt frame in the middle of her dining room, the big oak pedestal table pushed into the corner. I stood at the edge of the quilt and fingered Lou Era's autograph. Then I ran my hand over "Good Luck, Eleanor Roosevelt," thinking I never met a woman who could look at a piece of material without touching it. I bet even Eleanor Roosevelt had pinched that fabric between her thumb and forefingers before she wrote her name. I looked over the rows of famous names and felt pride that they were all part of a quilt in Harveyville, Kansas, a quilt that had been my idea. We stood impatiently waiting for Forrest Ann to assign us places around the quilt, which it was her privilege to do since we were at her house. Ella was the best quilter, so of course she'd work on the center, where the stitches showed the most. I was surprised when Forrest Ann didn't put her there. She asked Ella to sit on the side. Then we placed Rita next to Ella instead of at the lower end, where the poorest quilter usually sat. That was a nice thing to do, even though Rita didn't understand what a compliment it was. Then Forrest Ann said, "Queenie, would you sit here, please, where you can work on the center?" Everyone smiled and nodded. "Ella ought to be there," I protested. "No, the celebrity quilt was your idea. You deserve the honor," she replied. "Besides, you're a fine quilter." I blushed and sat down on one of Forrest Ann's dining room chairs. Now I knew why Mrs. Judd had made me come to Persian Pickle. She and Forrest Ann had planned this ahead of time. I looked up and saw Mrs. Judd smiling at me, and I felt so lucky to have such good friends that tears came to my eyes. I didn't want anyone to see for fear they'd think I was crying over that night, so I picked up my pocketbook and searched for my thimble. Then I threaded my needle and took a stitch, carefully pulling the knot through the quilt top to hide it, and began to make tiny stitches around Edgar Bergen's autograph. With all the sorrows we'd been through, we hadn't had a regular Persian pickle in the longest time. The last one, in fact, had been at Opalina's the day the Hiawatha found Ben Crook's bones. Of course, with all the troubles, we'd seen plenty of one another. But I realized as I stitched how much I missed all of us sitting down and working together. There was something homey and comfortable about the way we bent over the quilt in Forrest Ann's parlor. I had Grover and I had the Persian pickle, some made to do with a lot less. "This sure is a pretty quilt," Mrs. Ritter said. "Don't you think so, Rita?" Rita muttered, "Uh-huh." "Are you going to write another newspaper story about it?" Mrs. Judd asked. Rita's first story about the celebrity quilt had been only a paragraph, and it hadn't included any of our names. Rita shrugged without looking up. "I'm pretty busy right now." She yanked at her needle and the thread pulled out of it. Rita licked the end of the thread, flattened it between her thumb and finger, and pushed it back through the eye of the needle. Mrs. Judd stopped stitching to watch Rita. "Tell me why people's so crazy to read about a murder. It seems to me they'd rather read about what a body's doing for those less fortunate." Mrs. Judd looked over at Ella, who didn't seem to be paying attention. Sometimes I wondered if Ella heard one single thing we said anymore. Her mind had always wandered, but since Ben's funeral she seemed more than ever to be living in some place that was far off from Harveyville. Rita looked up and gave Mrs. Judd a smug smile as if she knew a secret she wasn't telling. "Really? It would be awful nice if they read a picture," Opalina said. "Of us?" Ada Jane asked. "Of the quilt, of course," Opalina said, but Ada Jane and I exchanged glances. We both knew Opalina meant of us. I thought it would be awful nice, too. "Maybe I'll write about the quilt later on," Rita said. "Right now I can't let Queenie down. After what happened to us, I gave her my word that I'd solve Mr. Crook's, you know." She glanced at Ella and didn't finish. I put my needle down, wondering if I should protest. She'd never given me her word. She'd never given me her word she'd find Ben Crook's killer for my sake, nor did I ask her to promise any such thing. But I realized the club members knew that, so I kept my mouth shut. Sarah took a couple of back stitches and bit off her thread with her teeth, then reached for her spool. "If you ask me, it was just your bad luck you getting stopped like you did. There wasn't anybody after the two of you. The man who did it was only a bum passing through," she said. "I meant to tell you, Cheed said that he'd heard a car got stopped over at Emporia last evening because of a stump in the middle of the road." Rita and I looked at each other, and Opalina asked, "What happened?" "Nothing. Two big men got out of the car and moved the stump." Opalina cast a sidelong glance at Sarah's, waiting for her to continue. When she didn't, Opalina said, "I don't get it. If nothing happened, what does that prove?" "Why, that's the point of it, dearie. That stump didn't sprout by itself. Whoever's doing this doesn't have any idea who'll be coming along. It was an accident that two men were in the car last evening, just like it was an accident that Queenie and Rita were the ones who were stopped here. When that robber saw grown men get out of the car, he stayed hid. There's your proof." "What I think," Agnes T. Ritter said, but Mrs. Ritter had been watching Rita, who was getting fidgety as she listened to Sarah's and Opalina, so she interrupted Agnes T. Ritter. "I've been wondering how many raffle tickets do you think we're going to sell on this quilt?" Mrs. Ritter asked. Agnes T. Ritter was annoyed because she hadn't been allowed to tell us what she thought, and she opened her mouth to try again, but I didn't care what she had to say. Besides, like Rita, I didn't want to hear any more about the men in Emporia, so I piped up. "I'm going to ask Grover to sell the farm and buy all the chances. That way I'll win the quilt." "My stars, to think a farm in Harveyville is worth that much," Mrs. Ritter said. "We talked about the price we'd charge for the tickets and how many we'd print and who would buy them, and before we knew it, Forrest Ann called, 'Ready to roll.' 'Ready?' I said. 'Just hold your horses,' Mrs. Judd told us. She'd tangled her thread and had to break it off. Then she cut a new length, put it through her needle, and took hurried stitches. As the rest of us completed our sections, we stood up and stretched and admired one another's stitching. We were making good time. At last Mrs. Judd snipped off her thread and said, "Ready to roll." We stood back and watched Forrest Ann and Agnes T. Ritter roll the part of the quilt we just stitched over the top of the frame, unrolling an unquilted section from the bottom at the same time. While they did that, Ada June came over to me and put her arm around my waist. "I'm glad you came, Queenie. That's my favorite dress of yours," she said. I thanked her, and she whispered, "Aren't you glad Mrs. Judd forgot about reading?" "Oh, boy, am I whispered back, although I wasn't so sure Mrs. Judd had forgotten. We all felt the need to visit. As we took our places again, I saw Forrest Ann pat Nettie's arm. Nettie moved her neck as much as she could to smile up at her sister-in-law. Then her mouth trembled, and I wondered if Tyrone's rheumatism was acting up again. I hope not. I'd rather slop pigs than have to sit through another evening of tending Tyrone Burgett in a sick bed. Nettie looked worn out, and I thought that with all her worries she'd been an especially good friend, calling on me with the molasses pie and some of her fruit cake after what had happened to me. "I hope those pregnant girls appreciate all the work we're doing on this quilt," Agnes T. Ritter said after we'd gone back to stitching. "Agnes, for goodness sake," Mrs. Ritter looked at Agnes T. Ritter and shook her head. "I'm just saying, we went to a whole lot of work, and for all we know, it's for a bunch of tarts. That's who stays in those homes, you know, girls with no moral sense." She pressed her skinny lips together. Nettie drew in a breath so sharply that we all looked up at her. "Well, maybe not everyone, but I'll bet you most of them are. You can like it or lump it. I'm just saying what I think, which is girls who get in the family way when they're not married are no more than trash. Agnes T. Ritter sure was in a bad mood that day." Mrs. Ritter reached across the quilt and touched her arm. "Agnes, that's enough. We're not here to pass judgment." Agnes T. Ritter put her pointy nose in the air, but she shut up. Nettie turned her face away, but not before we saw the tears running down it. She tried to get up, but her chair was wedged in between Ella's and Opalina's, and she couldn't move. So she put her hands over her face and began to sob, the tears running down her nose and dripping on the autograph of B.B. Daniels. Forrest Ann got up and stood behind Nettie, her arms around her. "It's all right, honey. Everything's going to be all right." Forrest Ann sniffed back a few tears of her own. "Nettie's just concerned about Tyrone," she told us. But we know Tyrone wasn't the cause of Nettie's tears. One by one, as we remembered what had set Nettie off, we put our needles down and looked at Nettie with sympathy. No, it wasn't Tyrone's, except for Ella, who never did understand what was going on. Agnes T. Ritter was the last one to get it, and when she did, she sucked in her breath and said, "Velma's? Velma's? Oh, I didn't. Oh, my God." "Be still," Mrs. Judd told her quietly. "Ella, sweetheart, do you have any scissors?" "Oh," Ella said, looking around her chair. All of us searched about our places for the scissors until Mrs. Judd held them up in the air and said, "Good heaven, they were right here in my work basket all the time." Of course she had known they were there. She wanted to give Nettie a chance to blow her nose and dry her eyes with a piece of toilet paper from her pocket. By the time we turned to Nettie again, she had stopped crying, but her eyes were red and her face was blotchy. The scarf had slipped off her neck, and her garter quivered like a piglet. Forrest Ann, who was still standing in back of Nettie's chair, tucked the scarf around Nettie's collar. "I guess you could say Velma's one of the less fortunates," Nettie said at last, giving a short, bitter laugh. "It's her business," Mrs. Ritter said, taking 3 or 4 stitches in the quilt and pulling the thread through. "It's not ours." "It'll be everybody's business before long," Forrest Ann said. Mrs. Judd picked up her needle and took a stitch, and the rest of us followed. Then Rita piped up. We used to say in college that the first baby can come any time. After that, it takes 9 months. Rita failed to notice that the rest of us didn't think it was funny. When's Velma getting married? Nettie shot her a quick look. She's not. Oh, Agnes T. Ritter said. Oh, heavens. He's a married man, if you must know, Nettie said, and began crying again. We all made little murmurs of sympathy until Mrs. Judd cleared her throat. What does Tyrone say? He doesn't know. Velma's afraid to tell him. I'm afraid to tell him too, if you want to know the truth, Nettie said. You know how much he sets store by how a person keeps the commandments. She looked around the circle at each one of us, as if under these circumstances we'd point out that Tyrone Burgett's standards were always for the other fellow. As far as I knew, Tyrone didn't personally keep any of the commandments apart from not working on the Sabbath. Nettie and Velma don't want to disappoint Tyrone. He'd be so hurt, Forstan put in. We all knew that wasn't it. They were afraid Tyrone would throw Velma out of the house and maybe Nettie with her. Sometimes these young girls have accidents, Opalina said. We all knew exactly what Opalina meant, and I shuddered. No, Forstan said quietly. I asked Doc Sipes. Velma's too far along. It would likely kill her. I looked down at the quilt and saw how crooked my last few stitches were, and I pulled them out. I guess it's up to us to figure out what's to become of Velma, Mrs. Judd said. She was right. The others knew it and stopped talking to concentrate on sewing. We were women who turned to our needles when there were problems to be dealt with. If she needs a place to stay, she can always live with Cheed and me, Sarah said. We'd welcome a young person and a baby. Nettie shook her head. That wouldn't work because Tyrone would find out about it and he'd give you Hail Columbia along with Velma and me, but thank you just the same, Sarah's. Nettie put her needle aside and said in a voice filled with shame, Besides, Velma doesn't want to keep the baby. Oh, I said, wondering why women like Velma and Rita, who didn't want children, got pregnant, while God denied me a baby, even though I wanted one more than anything in the world. He even gave 5 at one time to that Dion family in Canada. Was that fair? Maybe things like that happened because God was a man and didn't understand. I wanted to ask the others what they thought, but I was afraid Nettie would call me blasphemous. Nettie glanced at me and continued, I'm not saying Velma's wrong about that, but it would break my heart knowing there's a tiny baby out there someplace who's Velma's flesh and blood and mine too, and it's living in an orphan home with nobody to love it. The baby will end up in one of those places just like corn in a crib if Velma doesn't keep it, since nobody in times like these can afford to take in an extra mouth to feed. It's not right to leave a baby to be brought up an orphan. Nettie poked her needle into the quilt and took a single stitch. Velma will have to stay here in Harveyville to have the baby. We don't even have the money to send her to a home. They charge something, you know. We could all help out, Opalina said. We could raise the money ourselves. We're women. All we have is egg money. If we ask our husbands, well, we'll have to tell them why, and then everybody will know, Ada June said. That was true. Agnes T. Ritter began to say something, but stopped before Mrs. Ritter could interrupt her. The rest of us thought hard, but couldn't come up with any suggestions. Finally, when it seemed like there was no answer at all, Mrs. Judd spoke up. And it occurred to me that she had had a plan all along. I know one person who could pay, that is, if he doesn't spend all his money trying to corner the market on this quilt, Mrs. Judd said. I looked up quickly because it sounded like she meant Grover. He and I were better off than most, that was true, but we didn't have money to throw away. And if we had, Grover wouldn't give it to Tyrone Burgett's daughter. Mrs. Judd was staring at me, and I stared right back while the others looked from her to me. Then I had a terrible thought, and before I could stop myself, I blurted out, Are you saying Grover's the father? Are you accusing Grover of committing adultery? I heard one of the Pickles sucking her breath, but I didn't look because I wouldn't take my eyes off Mrs. Judd. "Oh, no such thing," Mrs. Judd said quickly. "Don't get your dander up, Queenie. I know well enough who Velma took up with, and so do you, I expect. What I'm saying is this. Velma's going to have a baby she doesn't want, and you want a baby you don't have. Now we can use one problem to solve the other. If Grover's willing to pay for Velma's keep in Kansas City, I guess she'd let you keep the baby. Isn't that about right, Nettie?" "Well, of course she would. It's a fact," Mrs. Judd told her. My hand holding the needle began to shake. I'd been doing a lot of shaking lately, but this time it wasn't from fear. I tried to stop it with my other hand, but I jammed myself so hard with the needle that a drop of blood ran out onto the autograph of Mae West. I didn't feel the prick because what Mrs. Judd had said was running around in my mind like a chicken without its head, and there wasn't room in there to think of anything else. I knew the club members had stopped talking and were staring at me, but I couldn't make their faces come into focus. "What if Velma wanted it back?" I asked at last. "She doesn't. I already asked her," Mrs. Judd said. "You and Grover would have to adopt it legal, of course. If Velma ever did want it back, she'd have no way to prove it was hers. Still she won't. She's got no way to support it, and the father won't have anything to do with it or her. Either after she told him about the baby, why he said it wasn't even his. Besides, you know Velma, she wanted to get out of Harveyville since the day she was born. She says after the baby comes, she'll stay on in Kansas City or move to Chicago or Omaha, anywhere that isn't Harveyville, Kansas." "Harveyville's not so bad," Opalina said. "That's beside the point," Mrs. Judd told her, glancing at Opalina just long enough to let her know she thought Opalina was crazy. Opalina ducked her head and returned to her stitches. Everyone else turned to me. "I don't know if Grover would raise a foundling," I said. "Velma's baby's not a foundling," Forrest Ann spoke up. "It's not a pig in a poke, where you don't know if it's got an inherited disease or foreign blood. Grover'll know it came from an American Christian family. Grover would also know that it came from Tyrone Burgett's family, because I wouldn't deceive him. Grover had no use at all for Tyrone, and he didn't approve of Velma either, not after she'd gone to town. Still, he knew she'd been a nice girl once. Would Grover blame a baby for its mother? I didn't know. The baby's parents weren't the only problem. There was another question, and that was, would Grover want to raise anybody else's baby at all? We'd never talked about adopting. After Dr. Sipes told me I'd never get pregnant again, babies were a subject neither of us ever brought up. "Well," Mrs. Judd asked me. All the Pickles were waiting for a reply. I looked at her, then at Nettie, and back at Mrs. Judd. "I could ask him," I said slowly. "I'd have to tell him the truth. It wouldn't be right not to." "Grover Bean'll do anything you say if you ask him. It's as good as done," Mrs. Judd said. "I guess this settles it." Nettie quivered a little and reached up to pat Forrest Ann's hand, which was on her shoulder. "I won't interfere, Queenie, I promise you that. It would be your baby, but could I come visit sometimes? Would that be all right?" "Well, of course you could. All of you can," I said. "Even Velma could come and visit." "Oh, she wouldn't," Nettie said quickly. The others went back to quilting, but I was too excited to continue my sewing. Even if I was stitching Mae West's name, I stuck my needle into the quilt top and leaned back in my chair, shutting my eyes to recall everything that had been said. The conversation had happened so quickly that it made me dizzy. In hardly more time than it took to sew a thread length, I'd gone from a barren woman to a mother. That is, if Grover approved. But Mrs. Judd was right about that. Grover wouldn't say no. When I opened my eyes, I saw my friends glancing up at me as they quilted and smiling. I was going to have a baby. When it's time for her to show, Velma will just say she's got a job in Kansas City, Mrs. Judd said, and we all nodded. It'll be our secret. Of course, except for Grover, we won't tell a soul. That's crazy, Rita blurted out. I never heard of anything so dumb. Nobody can keep a secret like that. Somebody will let it slip, and in 5 minutes the whole town will know. No, I said. I'm sorry, Queenie, but somebody's going to tell. Mrs. Judd held her needle still and peered at Rita over her glasses. She looked down at the square in front of her and ran her hand over it before she said in a flat, even voice, "The rest of us can keep a secret. Were you planning on telling?" "No, of course not." Rita looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Judd shrugged. "Then that's that. There's nothing to worry about." She looked over the quilt and asked, "Ready to roll?" We stood up and stretched, except for Rita, who stayed in her chair, shaking her head. Persian Pickle lasted late because we stayed to finish the celebrity quilt just as Mrs. Judd had predicted, even though I was in the worst hurry to get home and talk to Grover. But I'd come with Mrs. Judd, so I had to wait while we took the quilt out of the frame and held it up for everyone to admire, then turned it over to look for places we'd missed. At last Opalina got out her Kodak and took views of all of us standing on the porch holding the quilt. After that, I hopped from one foot to the other, waiting for Mrs. Judd to leave, and even walked over to the Packard, hoping that would hurry her up. The club members carried the quilt back into the house, but Rita remained outside, leaning against Forrest Ann's cistern, watching the women. She ought to have felt comfortable at Persian Pickle by now. We'd all made such an effort with her, but she still seemed to be apart from us, and I wondered if she'd ever really be a member. Rita motioned for me to come over to her. "Queenie, you're nuts if you're going along with this. I know the female sex," Rita said. "Maybe you do, but I know these women, and they won't say anything. I trust them." I watched Mrs. Judd come down the steps with Nettie, whose legs were lumpy under her flesh-colored stockings, and wondered if Velma's baby would have sawdust legs like that. The idea made me grin. Rita thought I'd smile because of what she'd said. "I don't know why you think that's funny. If you knew what I know, you wouldn't trust Mrs. Judd any further than you could throw her." Now Rita smiled. "Further than you can throw her. That's pretty funny, huh? I bet even Grover couldn't throw her more than a foot." I didn't answer. After all Mrs. Judd had just done for me, I wasn't about to make fun of her. Rita pushed out her lower lip when I didn't reply, then tossed her head back, sending her buttery curls bouncing. I found out some pretty interesting things, and like I said, I don't trust the Judds at all. You won't either when you know what I do. It makes me mad just to think about it. I'll come around and tell you. She wanted me to ask her what it was, but I didn't care to know. "Don't bother," I said, "but I wish you'd come around and help me make a baby quilt." And that's the end of chapter 9. All right. See y'all later. Bye.